Imagine hell, not as fire and brimstone, but as suffocating darkness. The relentless drip of water echoes off stone, a soundtrack to forgotten screams. Then, the smell. Copper, rust, and something profoundly, sickeningly organic. It's the kind of scent that makes your body scream for escape before your mind even grasps the horror. In the year 1478, beneath the ducal palace in Milan, a man named Giovanni Borromeo hung suspended. His wrists, bound behind his back, strained against ropes. 6 agonizing hours had passed. His shoulders, pulled from their sockets within the first 20 minutes, were the least of his agony. The easy part, if anything in this place could be called easy. What awaited Giovanni, a mere clerk accused of stealing 12 florins from the treasury, would consume 3 days.
3 days, during which he would confess to crimes he never committed, betray friends who were utterly innocent, and ultimately beg for a death that would refuse to come quickly. His torturer, a man named Abramo, approached. Abramo, whose family line had perfected this dark craft for 3 generations, carried an instrument. It gleamed with a chilling, almost medical precision. 437 times Abramo had performed this ritual. He understood the fragile line between a human being and a screaming piece of meat. He knew exactly how much pain a body could endure before a mind fractured completely. And he knew that moment, for Giovanni, was still many, many hours away. What Abramo could not know, what he could never fathom, was that 5 centuries later, archaeologists would unearth this very chamber. They would find his meticulously crafted instruments, devices so sophisticated in their cruelty that even modern engineers would struggle to fully grasp their function. They would discover bones, bearing marks that whispered tales of suffering so prolonged than systematic. Forensic specialists would require counseling after their analysis. They would find records, detailed beyond belief, documenting every session, every scream, every confession, revealing that medieval torturers possessed a terrifyingly precise understanding of human anatomy and psychology. This was not an age of random brutality, not some crude, barbaric era. No, this was an age of industrialized suffering, an age where the science of pain was studied, refined, and passed down through family dynasties with the same dedication scholars applied to theology or philosophy. An age where causing maximum agony while keeping victims alive for the longest possible duration was considered a professional skill worthy of guild membership and family pride. Forget everything you think you know about medieval torture. Not because it was less brutal than popular culture suggests, quite the opposite, it was worse. Systematically, scientifically, incomprehensibly worse. Those iron maidens, the racks, the thumb screws you've seen in museums, those were the basic tools, the common instruments for everyday interrogation. What we are about to explore goes far beyond those familiar horrors. Tonight, we will delve into 20 methods designed to maximize agony and prolong suffering, often exploiting neurological responses modern science only identified in the 20th century. Much of this history was deliberately hidden or lost, either because authorities feared public reaction or because the Church sought to erase records of its complicity in atrocities. Yet, fragments survived in personal diaries, medical texts, and, most damningly, in archaeological evidence. If you find yourself thinking, "That cannot be real," remember this: every method I describe is documented in primary sources, every instrument unearthed, every technique confirmed by modern forensic science. Let us begin with a method so psychologically devastating that victims often descended into permanent madness before any physical harm even occurred. You have heard of sleep deprivation as a torture technique. Modern interrogators use it, and governments have been condemned for it. But what medieval torturers discovered about sleeplessness went far beyond anything practiced today. The vigil, as it was known, was initially developed in Spanish monasteries during the 13th century. It began as a religious practice where monks sought divine visions through extreme sleep denial. When the Inquisition formed in 1231, they recognized its sinister potential, transforming spiritual discipline into systematic psychological destruction.
Isabella de Córdoba became one of its first documented victims in 1247. Her crime? Practicing Jewish rituals in secret, a capital offense in medieval Spain. The inquisitors didn't just want a confession, they wanted names, her entire network of secret Jews exposed. Isabella refused. She was genuinely Catholic, she insisted, and had committed no crime. For the first 3 days, guards simply kept her awake, poking her with sticks whenever her eyes drooped. This was the crude beginning. By day 4, Isabella was hallucinating, seeing demons in the corners of her cell, hearing voices commanding her to confess. By day 7, she no longer recognized her own children when they were brought to visit. By day 9, she confessed to crimes that were physically impossible, describing rituals that bore no resemblance to actual Jewish practice, naming people who did not exist, weaving an elaborate fantasy generated by her broken mind, all to make the sleeplessness stop. But here is what made the vigil truly horrific. The inquisitors did not accept her confession. A confession obtained under torture was, by their own legal standards, considered unreliable. So, they allowed Isabella to sleep for 2 days, waited for her mind to partially recover, and then asked her to confirm her confession voluntarily. When she recanted, explaining she had invented everything to end the torment, they began the vigil again. This cycle repeated for 11 weeks. Sleep deprivation until psychosis, a brief recovery, a request for confirmation, a recantation, then more sleep deprivation. By the end, Isabella existed in a state modern psychiatrists would recognize as permanent dissociative disorder. She confirmed her confession not because she was tortured into it, but because she genuinely no longer knew what was real. She had confessed so many times that the false memories had overwritten her actual memories. She believed she was guilty because her mind could no longer access the truth. The vigil was eventually refined to include sensory elements that accelerated the breakdown. Constant dripping water, irregular loud noises, flickering lights in cells. The unpredictability prevented adaptation. The body could not adjust to a pattern because there was no pattern. Modern research confirms that unpredictable stress causes more psychological damage than predictable stress of greater intensity. Medieval torturers discovered this through experimentation 5 centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. Records from the Toledo Inquisition show the vigil had an 89% confession rate, compared to 63% for physical torture alone. More importantly, vigil confessions were considered more legally valid because victims appeared to confess voluntarily after their recovery sleep. The technique was so effective, it spread across Europe within decades, adopted by secular authorities who recognized its insidious power. What happened to Isabella de Córdoba? She was burned at the stake in Wagnell 1248 after confirming her confession. Her children were taken by the church, her property was seized, and her case became a grim template applied to thousands of other victims over the following 3 centuries. Yet, the vigil was considered a gentle method. What comes next was reserved for cases requiring more aggressive interrogation. The instrument looked almost elegant, polished metal, shaped like a pear, small enough to fit a torturer's palm. At its base, a screw mechanism separated 4 segments when turned. Museums often display these objects with clinical descriptions,
utterly failing to convey their true, horrific purpose. The pear of anguish was inserted into body cavities, rectal for men accused of homosexuality, vagina for women accused of sexual crimes, oral for those accused of heresy or blasphemy. Once inserted, the torturer slowly turned the screw, expanding the segments millimeter by agonizing millimeter until tissue tore. A court record from Lyon, 1326, describes its use on a woman named Margaret, accused of adultery. Expanded over 4 hours, expansion halted when she lost consciousness, then resumed upon revival. Its stated purpose: extract names. Its actual purpose, clear from the document's almost gleeful tone, was punishment through suffering, designed to leave permanent, undeniable damage. The precision was horrifying. Gear mechanisms allowed fractional adjustments, keeping victims at the very edge of tissue failure, maximizing pain while preventing the merciful release of severe injury. Some variants even included spikes on the segments, embedding in flesh, ensuring any movement caused additional, excruciating damage. Modern gynecologists examining surviving pairs note their design exploited anatomical knowledge supposedly beyond medieval medical understanding. They were engineered to apply pressure to nerve clusters while skillfully avoiding major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. This was not random cruelty, it was cruelty designed with anatomical expertise. Multiple sizes existed. Oral pairs dislocated jaws, smaller variants targeted extremities like fingers, toes, and ears. Craftsmen like Venice's Lorenzo Berti created custom pairs, sometimes with religious imagery engraved, so victims would see saints and angels as the instrument destroyed them from within. The psychological element was crucial. Victims were often shown the pair before interrogation began, told its function, and given a chance to confess. Many did. Those who did not faced damage that never fully healed. Survivors carried permanent injuries, indelible marks of their encounter with authority, scars that could never be hidden or denied. The pair, by the 14th century, was standard equipment in most European judicial torture chambers. The next method was reserved for crimes considered even more serious. Imagine a wooden pyramid, roughly 3 feet tall, mounted on a sturdy frame, with ropes and pulleys attached to the ceiling above. Now, imagine being stripped naked, suspended by harnesses around your arms and legs, and slowly, painstakingly lowered onto that pyramid's point. The Judas cradle worked through the victim's own body weight. They were lowered until the pyramid's apex pressed against their most sensitive areas, then left to hang with just enough support that their full weight was not immediately applied. Over hours, exhaustion would cause their muscles to fail, lowering them further onto the point. The torture was essentially self-inflicted, a progressive impalement. A Florentine banker named Aldo Grimaldi experienced the Judas cradle in 1411, accused of financial crimes against the Medici family. Court records show he was suspended for 9 hours on the first day, 8 hours on the second, and 11 hours on the third, before confessing to embezzlement he may or may not have actually committed. The confession became irrelevant when he died of infection 16 days later, his internal injuries having become septic despite the physician's attempts at treatment. The genius of the Judas cradle, if such a word can be applied to something so monstrous, was its efficiency. Unlike methods requiring constant attention from torturers, the cradle worked automatically. A single guard could monitor multiple victims simultaneously, only intervening to raise them slightly when unconsciousness threatened to end the session prematurely. Records from the judicial prison in Nuremberg show that one torturer successfully managed 4 cradles operating concurrently, ensuring maximum suffering with minimum staff. The device was also valued for leaving no visible external injuries. Victims could be displayed publicly after interrogation without obvious signs of torture, maintaining the legal fiction that confessions were voluntary, as internal damage remained invisible. This made the Judas cradle particularly popular for extracting confessions from nobility or clergy, whose torture needed to be deniable. Variations existed. The Italian version typically had a sharper point for shorter, more intense sessions, while the German Judas stool featured a blunter point for extended torture. The Spanish even heated the pyramid, adding burning to the trauma. What the archaeological record shows is that many victims of the Judas cradle never stood trial. The injuries were often fatal, regardless of their confession.
The device was not really about information, it was about demonstrating authority's power. The confession was almost incidental to the suffering itself. But compared to what comes next, the Judas cradle was almost merciful in its relative speed. This next section will be difficult. What I'm about to describe was used almost exclusively on women, its purpose extending beyond interrogation into pure punishment, designed to destroy femininity itself. The breast ripper was exactly what its name suggests. Iron claws, often heated until glowing, attached to handles designed to grip and tear breast tissue. This device targeted women accused of adultery, self-induced abortion, heresy, witchcraft, or, in some cases, simply for being unmarried past a certain age. Agnes Bernau was subjected to it in Bavaria in 1435. Her crime, marrying above her station, a commoner secretly wed to Duke Albert III. The Duke's father had her arrested on fabricated witchcraft charges. The torture served no interrogation purpose. There was nothing to confess. It was pure punishment for a woman who had dared to rise above her assigned place. Agnes survived the initial torture, but was then drowned in the Danube, her mutilated body displayed as a warning to other women who might imagine themselves worthy of nobility. Her story became legend in Bavaria, though the legend typically romanticizes the drowning while omitting the preceding torture. Two main variants existed: the spider, a fixed wall-mounted device, and a less sophisticated, handheld version. Both were often heated before use, combining tearing with burning. Its particular cruelty lay in targeting anatomy associated with nurturing and femininity. The destruction was as symbolic as it was physical. Women who survived, and some did, bore scars that marked them permanently as fallen, punished objects of public shame. In an era when women's value was tied to marriage and motherhood, the breast ripper dressed both possibilities, leaving victims alive to experience the social consequences. Church records from the witch trial period show the breast ripper was used during interrogation to encourage confessions, but also prescribed as punishment after conviction for particularly severe crimes, like allegedly causing crop failures or childhood deaths. The gender specificity of this torture reveals something important about medieval justice. Torture was not applied equally. Women faced instruments specifically designed to attack their bodies in ways that men did not. The breast ripper had no male equivalent because the torture was not just about pain, it was about destroying womanhood, specifically about punishing female bodies for being female bodies that had somehow transgressed. We need to continue, but the instruments become more elaborate from here. If you've heard of medieval torture, you've probably heard of breaking on the wheel. But the reality of this punishment was far more systematic and prolonged than popular depictions suggest. The condemned was stripped and spread across a large wooden wheel with arms and legs extended along its spokes.
The executioner then used a heavy iron hammer or wheel to systematically break every major bone in the body. The sequence was precise and followed written protocols that varied by region. In the German territories, the standard sequence was ankles first, then shins, then knees, then thighs, then pelvis, then forearms, then upper arms, then hands. Each bone was struck 3 times with carefully measured force designed to fracture without severing. The entire process took between 45 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the executioner's skill and the desired level of suffering. A man named Peter Stump was broken on the wheel in Bedburg, Germany in 1589. His crime was supposedly being a werewolf, but his actual crime was probably being an unpopular outsider during a period of hysteria. The court record describes his execution with disturbing precision. First, his skin was torn with red-hot pincers in 10 separate places. Then, his limbs were broken on the wheel. Then, his arms and legs were removed with an axe. Only then was he beheaded, and finally, his body was burned. The entire execution took approximately 3 hours. Stump was conscious for most of it. The wheel was specifically designed to inflict maximum damage while avoiding rapid death. Breaking bones is agonizing, but it rarely causes immediate death unless major blood vessels are severed. The protocol avoided the heart, the neck, and the major arteries precisely so that victims would remain alive and aware throughout. But breaking was only the first part. After the bones were shattered, the body was woven through the wheel's spokes, threading ruined limbs between the wooden bars to create a display. The wheel was then mounted on a tall pole and left in public view. Some victims died within hours from shock or blood loss. Others survived for days, exposed to the elements, their broken bodies unable to move while birds began feeding on them while they still lived. A French court record from Toulouse documents a man who survived on the wheel for 9 days before finally dying. Each day, a priest visited to offer him the opportunity to confess additional sins and receive final absolution. Each day he was technically alive, though beyond any possibility of recovery. The priest's diary describes the smell, the sounds, the progressive deterioration of a human body that was no longer really human, but not yet permitted to be dead. The wheel was public entertainment. Crowds gathered to watch executions, and the display afterward served as an ongoing warning. Children grew up seeing broken bodies mounted on wheels at city entrances. The sight became so normal that medieval art often includes wheel displays in background scenes of everyday life, casual evidence of state power's ultimate expression. What we know from medical analysis of skeletal remains is that the wheel was remarkably effective at causing suffering without causing death. Bones healed incorrectly if victims survived long enough, creating twisted masses of calcified tissue that would have been agonizing even during recovery. Some victims were taken down from wheels and survived, living the remainder of their lives as permanently disfigured warnings. The next method worked on similar principles, but applied them internally. This technique required no specialized equipment: a bucket, a rat, fire, and time. The victim was restrained on their back, unable to move. A metal bucket or cage was placed on their abdomen, open side down, with a rat trapped inside. Fire was then applied to the outside of the container, heating the metal and the air within. The rat, desperate to escape the heat, would dig downward through the only soft surface available: human flesh. A political prisoner in the Tower of London reportedly experienced this torture in 1328, though records are deliberately vague about identities during this period. What survives is a physician's description of the aftermath. The rat had burrowed completely through the abdominal wall before dying of heat exhaustion inside the body cavity. The victim survived the initial torture but died of infection 17 days later, despite the physician's attempts to remove the animal's remains. The psychological element was as devastating as the physical damage. Victims were fully aware of what was happening but unable to prevent it. They could feel the rat's claws and teeth.
They could hear it panicking. They knew exactly what was coming as the heat increased and the animal grew more desperate. Many victims confessed before the fire was even lit, the anticipation proving more effective than actual application. Medieval torturers discovered that smaller rats burrowed faster but caused less damage. Larger rats took longer to begin digging, but created wounds that were almost always fatal. The choice of rat became a decision about whether the torture's purpose was confession or death. Some records indicate that pregnant rats were preferred because their desperation to protect offspring made them dig more frantically. Variants of this torture appeared across Europe and Asia independently, suggesting that multiple cultures discovered the same horrific principle without direct contact. The Persians used a similar technique with honey and insects. The Chinese developed methods using bamboo shoots that grew through living bodies over weeks.
The commonality reveals something disturbing about human creativity applied to causing suffering. What modern forensic pathologists find most remarkable is that some victims of rat torture survived. Their bodies healed around wounds that should have been invariably fatal. The human capacity for survival apparently exceeded even medieval torturers' understanding. These survivors carried scars and internal damage that marked them permanently, living evidence of what they had endured. But the rat torture, while horrifying, was relatively quick. The next method was designed to extend suffering over weeks or months. The rack is famous for stretching bodies. The scavenger's daughter did the opposite. It compressed them. Invented by a lieutenant of the Tower of London named Skivington during the reign of Henry VIII, this A-frame device forced victims into a crouched position, then applied metal bars that pressed the body inward. The head was forced down toward the knees.
The arms were crushed against the torso. Breathing became progressively more difficult as the compression increased. Unlike stretching, which damages joints and eventually tears tissue, compression affects every system simultaneously. The lungs cannot fully expand. Blood circulation becomes restricted. Internal organs are pressed together. The pain is diffuse and inescapable, coming from everywhere at once rather than specific points. A Catholic priest named Thomas Codum was subjected to the scavenger's daughter in 1582. His crime was practicing the wrong version of Christianity in Protestant England. Records indicate he was compressed for several hours until blood flowed from his nose, ears, and other orifices. He still refused to reveal the locations of other Catholic priests. The torture was repeated on 3 separate occasions before his eventual execution by hanging and quartering.
What made the scavenger's daughter particularly effective for extracting confessions was its reversibility. Unlike torture that caused permanent damage immediately, compression could be increased gradually and reduced if the victim began cooperating. This allowed torturers to demonstrate their power, achieve partial confession, ease pressure as reward, then increase again when victims stopped cooperating. The cycle could continue for days or weeks with the same victim. Medical experts who have studied the device note that prolonged compression causes damage even when visible bleeding does not occur. Compartment syndrome, where muscles are damaged by sustained pressure, was almost certainly a common outcome. Victims who survived might have retained their confessions, but lost the use of limbs that had been compressed too long. The scavenger's daughter was considered a more refined torture than the rack, appropriate for higher status prisoners, whose screams might cause political complications if too extreme. A gentleman could be compressed silently in ways that stretching, with its dramatic joint dislocations and tearing sounds, could not achieve. The device was torture made discreet, invisible suffering that left fewer marks and attracted less attention. What follows is a method that combined physical and psychological torture in ways the scavenger's daughter could not match. Simplicity can be more terrifying than complexity. The heretic's fork was simply a metal rod with two-pronged forks at each end. It was worn by victims with one fork pressed under the chin and the other against the sternum, held in place by a leather strap around the neck. The forks prevented any movement of the head or neck. Looking down pushed the lower fork into the chest. Looking up drove the upper fork into the throat. Speaking caused both forks to dig into flesh. Swallowing did the same. Even breathing required careful control to minimize the constant pressure of metal against skin. Victims wearing the heretic's fork could not sleep because any relaxation of neck muscles caused injury. They could not eat because chewing was impossible. They could not speak to confess even if they wanted to. They existed in a state of exhausted tension, every moment requiring conscious effort to avoid additional pain. A woman accused of witchcraft in Bavaria in 1590 wore the heretic's fork for 11 days before her execution. Court records note that by the end she could no longer stand, could not speak coherently, and had lost significant blood from wounds where the forks had slowly pressed through skin into underlying tissue. She confessed by nodding, the only movement that did not cause the forks to dig deeper. The heretic's fork was often engraved with the Latin word abjuro, meaning I recant. Victims would see this word constantly during their ordeal, a reminder that confession would end the suffering. The psychological pressure of escape being so close, requiring only capitulation, combined with the physical reality that speaking to recant would cause immediate additional pain. The device created a trap where relief required action that itself caused suffering. What made the fork particularly useful for authorities was that it required minimal supervision. A victim could be fitted with the device and left for days, checked periodically, but not requiring constant attention. One guard could monitor dozens of fork prisoners simultaneously. The torture was essentially automated, the victim's own body movements determining how much suffering they experienced. Some variants included longer forks designed to penetrate through the throat into the mouth or through the chest wall toward internal organs. These versions were for execution rather than interrogation, the fork becoming a method of slow impalement that could take days to prove fatal. The design principle behind the fork, using the victim's body against itself, appears again in the next method, but applied to an entirely different part of anatomy. The device resembled a vise, two wooden blocks faced with metal spikes positioned to grip the knee from above and below. A screw mechanism drew the blocks together with irresistible force. The spikes penetrated flesh first, then cartilage, then bone. Unlike crushing injuries that are immediately catastrophic, the knee splitter worked gradually. Torturers could increase pressure to the point of maximum pain, then hold that position for hours before continuing. The knee, with its complex arrangement of bones, cartilage, and ligaments, provided numerous stages of destruction, each accompanied by distinct sensations that victims could not help but feel in terrible detail.
A Protestant reformer named Balthasar Hubmaier was subjected to the knee splitter in Vienna in 1919. His interrogators wanted names of other Anabaptists, locations of secret meeting places, and details of their heresies. The records indicate that Hubmaier initially resisted, but eventually provided extensive information after both knees were destroyed. He was then burned at the stake, unable to stand for his own execution. The knee splitter was valued for creating permanent disability without causing death. A prisoner could be tortured to extract information, then kept alive for trial, conviction, and public execution. The destroyed knees served as visible evidence of interrogation that spectators at executions would see and understand. The message was clear. Even before being killed, this person was broken by state power. Variants of the device existed for other joints.
Elbow splitters, ankle splitters, and wrist splitters all operated on the same principle, but targeted different anatomy. Some torturers developed sequential approaches, destroying joints one by one over multiple sessions, giving victims time to anticipate what was coming next. The waiting, knowing exactly what the next session would bring, was considered part of the torture. Modern orthopedic surgeons who have examined medieval splitter devices note that they were engineered with an understanding of joint anatomy that should not have existed given the era's official medical knowledge. The spike placement targeted specific structures in ways that suggest either extensive experimentation or access to anatomical information that the Church officially suppressed. What we know about victims of joint splitters comes primarily from skeletal remains. Bones show evidence of crushing, followed by attempted healing, indicating survival long enough for the body to begin repair processes.
The twisted calcified masses that formed around destroyed joints would have been sources of chronic pain for the remainder of victims' lives, however long or short those lives proved to be. The next method also targeted specific body parts, but with different objectives. Speech is the primary way humans express thought. Control speech and you control thought's expression. Eliminate speech entirely and you eliminate the person's ability to participate in human society. The tongue terror was designed to permanently silence. Metal tongues with roughened gripping surfaces were forced into the mouth, clamped around the tongue, and used to pull the organ out as far as possible. Then, either a blade or the tongs themselves were used to remove it entirely. This was typically punishment rather than torture for confession, since victims could not speak to confess once the procedure began. It was applied to those convicted of blasphemy, heresy, lying under oath, or speaking against authority. The goal was not information extraction, but permanent marking and silencing of those deemed too dangerous to allow continued speech. A preacher named Michael Sattler had his tongue torn out in Rottenburg in Mortenburg in Moten 15 Heinrichsjahr before being tortured further and burned alive. His crime was teaching Anabaptist beliefs that challenged both Catholic and mainstream Protestant doctrine. The tongue removal ensured he could not preach to the crowds that gathered to watch his execution. Authorities feared his words might inspire others even as he died. The tongue was sometimes removed only partially, leaving enough that victims could survive but not speak coherently. This created a permanent underclass of the maimed, people who could be identified immediately by their inability to communicate, who served as living warnings about the consequences of improper speech. Medieval cities contain numerous tongue removal survivors who begged on streets, their mutilation advertising state power constantly. What modern linguists and speech pathologists note is that tongue removal does not simply prevent speech. It affects eating, swallowing, and breathing.
Victims often died from aspiration, accidentally breathing food or liquid into their lungs because the tongue's role in directing swallowed material to the stomach rather than the airway was eliminated. Those who survived faced lifetimes of difficulty with basic functions that tongued people never consciously consider. The tongue terror represents a category of torture designed not for interrogation but for marking. The next method belongs to the same category but affected a more visible part of anatomy. Courts throughout medieval Europe used ear removal as a standardized punishment for a first offense of certain crimes. One ear for repeated offenses, both. The marks were permanent but impossible to hide, creating instant identification of criminals wherever they went. The instruments used varied from simple blades to specialized shears designed to remove the entire outer ear in a single motion. Speed was not mercy but efficiency. Executions were public spectacles with schedules to maintain. An executioner who took too long on ear removal delayed the rest of the proceedings. A thief in London named John Whiting lost his first ear in 1472 for stealing bread. Records show he lost the second in 1475 after being caught stealing again. He survived both procedures but vanished from historical records afterward. Without ears, he would have been visibly marked as a criminal everywhere he went. Employment, housing, normal participation in society would have been nearly impossible. The punishment did not end with the cutting, it continued every day for the remainder of his life. The psychological impact of facial mutilation was well understood by medieval authorities. Ears were removed publicly, with crowds watching, specifically because the public nature of the shaming was considered part of the punishment. The victim's community saw them marked. The memory of that public degradation would follow the victim forever, recalled every time someone noticed their missing ears. What made ear removal particularly effective as punishment was its visibility combined with survivability. Unlike tortures that risk death, ear removal almost never proved fatal. Victims lived to be marked, lived to be recognized, lived to serve as constant advertisements for the consequences of crime. A man without ears walking through a market communicated state power more effectively than any proclamation. Variants included removal of the nose, which was applied for sexual crimes and was even more disfiguring than ear removal. Some jurisdictions combined both, creating victims whose faces announced their crimes permanently. The creation of permanent visible underclasses served social control functions that extended far beyond punishing individual criminals. But these marking punishments, while cruel, were quick. The next method was designed to last. You have seen pictures of the Iron Maiden, the upright cabinet shaped like a woman, the spikes lining the interior. The horrifying implication of being enclosed inside while metal points penetrate from every direction. Here is what most people do not understand about the Iron Maiden. The spikes were not designed to kill quickly. They were designed to penetrate specific depths at specific locations, missing vital organs while piercing flesh in places that maximized pain and minimized rapid blood loss. The authentic Iron Maiden, as opposed to later recreations designed for exhibition rather than function, featured spikes of varying lengths, positioned to avoid the heart, major arteries, and other structures whose damage would cause quick death. Longer spikes penetrated through limbs, pinning victims in place. Shorter spikes pressed into torso areas where nerve density was high but vital organ damage was unlikely. A court record from Nuremberg, though some historians dispute its authenticity, describes an Iron Maiden execution in 1515. The victim, a coin counterfeiter, was placed inside and the door closed slowly over a period of 2 hours. Each partial closing drove spikes deeper. Confession opportunities were offered between each stage. By the time the door was fully closed, the counterfeiter had confessed, named accomplices, and revealed locations of forging equipment. He survived inside the maiden for 3 days before dying of blood loss and infection.
The psychological element was as important as the physical damage. Victims were enclosed in complete darkness. They could not see what was happening to their bodies, only feel it. The disorientation of blindness combined with pain from multiple points created maximum psychological impact. Some victims reportedly went insane before dying, their minds broken by the combination of pain, darkness, and helplessness. Modern metallurgists who have examined authentic Iron Maiden fragments note that the spikes were precision crafted, their lengths and positions consistent in ways that indicate deliberate design rather than random placement. Someone calculated exactly how deep a spike could penetrate the thigh without severing the femoral artery, exactly how far into the abdomen a point could extend without perforating the intestines. This was engineering applied to suffering. The Iron Maiden was expensive to construct and maintain.
It represented significant investment by authorities who could have chosen simpler, cheaper methods. Its continued use, despite the cost, suggests that its psychological impact on observers, the terrifying spectacle of a person-shaped torture device, was considered worth the expense. The Maiden was propaganda as much as punishment. What follows is a method that required far less investment but produced equally horrifying results. Sometimes called reverse hanging, the strapado was devastatingly simple. The victim's hands were bound behind their back. A rope was attached to the bound wrists and thrown over a ceiling beam. The victim was then hoisted off the ground by their arms, which were pulled backward and upward behind them. Within seconds, both shoulders would dislocate. The body's weight, suspended from twisted arms, created immediate catastrophic joint damage, but that was only the beginning. The Inquisition codified strapado into specific levels. First degree, simply hanging from 1 hour or 2. Second degree, adding weights to the victim's feet to increase joint stress. Third degree, dropping the victim suddenly and catching them before hitting the ground, the jerk causing additional damage to already destroyed shoulders. A man named Gian Giacomo was subjected to strapado in Milan in 1630 during the plague panic. Authorities believed the plague was being spread deliberately by plague spreaders and wanted Giacomo to confess to poisoning wells. Under strapado, he confessed. He named accomplices. He provided elaborate details about a conspiracy that was almost certainly fiction, created to make the torture stop. Giacomo was executed along with several men he had named. Years later, investigation revealed that no plague-spreading conspiracy had existed.
Giacomo Vattia and the others had confessed to imaginary crimes because strapado was so effective at producing confessions that it produced false ones as readily as true ones. The reliability problem with strapado was well known to medieval authorities. Numerous legal texts warned that confessions obtained through this method required external verification, but verification was rarely conducted. The confessions satisfied legal requirements regardless of their accuracy. And once confessed, retracting was difficult because recantation could result in additional torture for lying about the initial confession. Modern orthopedic surgeons describe the damage from strapado as permanent and progressive. Even without weights or drops, simple suspension quickly causes nerve damage, muscle tears, and ligament rupture. Victims who survived often lost use of their arms entirely. The joints never healed correctly.
Even victims who were ultimately found innocent carried permanent disability from interrogation. The strapado required minimal equipment and could be set up anywhere with a suitable ceiling. Its simplicity made it ubiquitous. Every jurisdiction had the capability. The technique was so common that medieval artists depicted it in manuscript illustrations with the casual familiarity of depicting farming or craftsmanship. Torture was simply part of how society functioned. The next method was more elaborate but served similar functions. Waterboarding is modern terminology for an ancient practice. Medieval torturers called it the water cure, the water torture, or simply the question by water. Whatever the name, the principle was identical across centuries. The victim was restrained on an inclined surface, head lower than feet. Cloth was placed over the face.
Water was then poured continuously over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning while preventing actual drowning through careful water volume control. The experience triggers immediate panic responses that victims cannot consciously override. The body believes it is dying. The mind follows. Within seconds, the most stubborn prisoner begins to break. Within minutes, almost anyone will confess to anything. A Spanish Inquisition manual from 1561 provides precise instructions. The cloth must be of linen, positioned to cover nose and mouth completely. Water should be poured in a steady stream from a height of approximately 2 feet. Sessions should not exceed 15 minutes without rest periods to prevent actual drowning. Skilled inquisitors could maintain a victim at the edge of drowning for hours, alternating water torture with brief recovery periods that existed only to allow the process to continue.
A woman named Marina de Cedra was subjected to water torture in Toledo in Mutnandria Tinken in 1573. She was accused of secretly practicing Judaism while publicly professing Catholicism. Records indicate that she resisted through 3 sessions of water torture before confessing. She was then released because her confession was deemed insufficiently detailed. After further investigation, she was arrested again and subjected to additional water torture. This time, she provided names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of rituals. She was burned at the stake in 1575. The water torture was considered one of the more reliable methods because it left no visible marks. Unlike techniques that scarred or maimed, water torture allowed victims to appear in court apparently unharmed. The legal fiction that confessions were voluntary could be maintained more easily when confessors showed no obvious signs of physical damage.
What modern neuroscientists understand about water torture is that it exploits involuntary panic responses hardwired into the brainstem. The drowning sensation triggers survival mechanisms that bypass conscious thought entirely. Victims cannot decide to resist because the responses are not under conscious control. The torture essentially removes agency, reducing victims to biological systems, responding automatically to perceived threat of death. Medieval torturers discovered this through experimentation centuries before the neuroscience existed to explain it. They knew water torture was effective against even the most resistant subjects without understanding exactly why. The knowledge was practical rather than theoretical. The next method targeted a different involuntary response. Heat causes pain that intensifies exponentially. A temperature that is uncomfortable becomes agonizing with additional degrees. A temperature that is agonizing becomes unbearable. Thus, somewhere beyond unbearable, the body begins to cook. The burning chair was exactly what it sounds like, a metal chair heated from below by fire. Victims were strapped into the chair naked, and the heat was increased gradually over hours. The metal never became hot enough to cause immediate burns. It simply grew warmer and warmer until sitting became impossible to endure. A German manual for executioners from the 16th century specifies temperature progressions. Begin with coals that make the metal warm to touch.
Add coals every quarter hour until the metal becomes too hot to touch comfortably. Continue until the metal would burn an unprotected hand immediately. At this temperature, maintain heat for questioning. Reduce heat if confession seems imminent. Increase if resistance continues. A man named Hinrich Kramer experienced the burning chair in Cologne in 1529. His crime was printing Protestant pamphlets. Records indicate the chair reached temperatures where his flesh began to adhere to the metal, tearing when he attempted to shift position. He confessed after approximately 4 hours. His legs below the knees were permanently damaged. He was executed by burning 2 days later. The irony of burning a man whose flesh had already partially cooked apparently lost on authorities. The burning chair exploited the progressive nature of heat damage. Unlike sudden burning, which causes immediate intense pain followed by nerve death, gradual heating maintained pain at maximum levels for extended periods. Nerves remained functional because the temperature was carefully controlled below the threshold that would destroy them. Victims felt everything for hours. Variants included heated metal boots, heated metal crowns, and heated metal gloves. Each targeted specific body parts where nerve density was high and heat sensitivity was extreme. The face, hands, and feet were particular favorites because damage to these areas was more psychologically devastating than damage to the torso. What modern burn specialists note is that the temperatures described in medieval torture records would cause deep tissue damage that extended far below the skin. Victims who survived would have faced months of agonizing healing, infection risks, and permanent scarring that affected function as well as appearance. A man whose feet were cooked in heated boots might never walk normally again, even if he survived all subsequent proceedings. The next method also involved fire, but applied it differently. Marking criminals with hot metal served multiple purposes. It was punishment in itself. It created permanent identification, and it demonstrated authority's power over bodies in ways that could not be hidden or denied. Branding was standardized across medieval Europe. A T for thief, an F for felon, an M for murderer, a B for blasphemer. The letters were pressed into foreheads or cheeks where they could not be concealed, creating walking advertisements for the consequences of crime. The procedure was public and relatively quick. The iron applied for only seconds, but those seconds were experienced as eternity. The smell of burning flesh filled public squares. The screams echoed off buildings. And afterward, the branded person walked through crowds that parted in disgust and fear, their social status permanently altered by a mark that would never fade. A woman branded in York in 1483 for prostitution bore the letter W on her forehead for the remaining 37 years of her life. Parish records indicate she never married, never found regular employment, never escaped the consequences of those few seconds when hot metal pressed into her skin. The branding took moments. The punishment lasted a lifetime. What made branding particularly effective was its simplicity combined with its permanence.
Unlike imprisonment, which ended, or execution, which removed the criminal from society entirely, branding created a permanent, visible underclass of the marked. They remained in society but excluded from it, serving as constant reminders of what authority could do to those who transgressed. Medieval authorities understood that the threat of branding sometimes exceeded the threat of execution in deterrent power. Death ends suffering. Branding initiates decades of shame, exclusion, and difficulty that continues until natural death finally brings relief. Some criminals reportedly preferred execution to branding, understanding that branded survival might be worse than an ended life.
The marks also served administrative functions. Branded criminals could be identified immediately if they reoffended. The escalating punishment system required knowing a criminal's prior record. Brands provided that record, written permanently on bodies, readable by any authority figure anywhere in the realm.
What follows is a method that combined the permanence of branding with far greater physical destruction. The removal of skin while the victim remains alive represents one of the most extreme tortures documented in medieval records. The process was exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Careful cutting separated skin from underlying tissue, peeling it away from living bodies in strips or sheets. Flaying typically began at the face. Executioners made incisions around the hairline and chin, then gradually separated the facial skin while victims remained conscious. The process could take hours. Skilled flayers could remove entire faces intact, presenting them to victims before continuing down the body. This was not common torture. It was reserved for crimes considered so severe that normal execution was insufficient. Treason against monarchs, rebellion against established order, crimes that threatened the foundations of authority itself.
A Hungarian rebel named György Doza was flayed alive in 15 Wibon after leading a peasant uprising. But his flaying included additional elements that elevated cruelty beyond even this already extreme method. He was seated on a heated iron throne. A heated iron crown was placed on his head, and his followers were forced to eat pieces of his flesh as it was removed. 9 of them who refused were executed immediately. The others complied, becoming complicit in their leader's torture as a condition of their own survival. The Doza execution was designed to demonstrate absolute power and to traumatize potential future rebels into submission. It worked. Hungarian peasant resistance collapsed for generations. The memory of what had been done to Doza served as a warning more effective than any number of ordinary executions could have provided. Flaying victims sometimes survived the initial procedure if it was limited to portions of the body. Survival was not mercy. Skinless tissue is extraordinarily vulnerable to infection. It weeps fluid continuously. It is agonizingly sensitive to any contact, including air movement. Survivors faced slow deaths from dehydration, infection, and shock that could take weeks to finally prove fatal. Medieval medical texts describe attempts to treat flaying victims, usually prisoners whose interrogators wanted them alive for additional questioning. The treatments were largely ineffective. Without modern understanding of wound care and infection control, flaying was essentially delayed execution, regardless of initial survival. The next method was less spectacular, but equally final. Strangulation by device rather than hands, the garrote. This was a seat with a metal collar that could be tightened by a screw mechanism behind the victim's head. Turn the screw and the collar closes. Continue turning and the airway closes. Continue further and the spine can be crushed. What distinguished the garrote from simple strangulation was its controllability. Executioners could tighten to the point of unconsciousness, then loosen to allow recovery, then tighten again. The cycle could continue indefinitely. Victims could be brought to the edge of death repeatedly without crossing over. Spain made the garrote its primary method of execution for centuries. The last execution by garrote in Spain occurred in 1974, making this medieval torture method one of the few that survived into the modern era virtually unchanged. A man named Salvador Puig Antich died by garrote in Barcelona that year. The executioner, who had performed dozens of similar executions, later described the process in interviews. 7 turns of the screw to unconsciousness, another 3 to death. The entire process took less than a minute in skilled hands. But medieval applications of the garrote were often deliberately prolonged. Political prisoners might experience partial strangulation daily for weeks. their necks bruising and swelling, but death always delayed. The garrote became a tool for breaking resistance through accumulated trauma rather than simply ending lives. The psychological element was significant. Unlike beheading or hanging, which happened quickly, the garrote required the victim to sit in the device, knowing exactly what was about to happen, feeling the collar around their neck, waiting for the first turn of the screw. The anticipation was considered part of the punishment. Women condemned for witchcraft were sometimes executed by garrote before being burned, the strangulation offering a quicker death than the flames would provide. This was considered mercy. The witch was dead before the fire reached her. Her burning body served the public spectacle purpose without requiring her to experience being burned alive.
The simplicity of the garrote, requiring only a chair, a collar, and a screw, made it accessible to any jurisdiction regardless of wealth. While elaborate torture devices required skilled craftsmen and significant investment, the garrote could be constructed by any competent metalworker. Its simplicity contributed to its widespread adoption. What remains to be discussed includes methods that were designed for specific purposes beyond simple punishment or interrogation. Division of the body through sawing was reserved for crimes considered so extreme that the criminal was not entitled to die as a single unit. The saw represented complete destruction. The body divided into pieces that could never be reassembled. The person literally unmade. The victim was suspended upside down, which served multiple functions. Blood rushed to the head, keeping the brain oxygenated and the victim conscious longer.
The inverted position was inherently degrading, and the sawing could begin at the groin, the most psychologically devastating starting point, while the victim watched their own body being divided. A trader in medieval Germany was reportedly sawed completely in half over a period of 2 hours. The inverted suspension meant he remained conscious until the saw reached his midsection, aware of every stroke as the blade worked through him. Witnesses described his screams changing in character as the saw progressed, from obvious agony to sounds that seemed barely human by the end. The saw was public spectacle at its most extreme. Crowds gathered to watch criminals unmade, to see the human body revealed in its constituent parts, to witness authorities' power to reduce persons to meat. The trauma inflicted on observers was part of the purpose. Citizens who had watched a sawing were unlikely to forget the consequences of crimes that merited such punishment.
Medieval art sometimes depicts sawing with disturbing matter-of-factness, the executioners going about their work with the same professionalism as butchers preparing livestock. The comparison was intentional. Criminals who merited sawing had forfeited their humanity. They were animals to be processed, not people to be executed. What forensic pathologists note about sawing is that the wounds are remarkably clean compared to hacking or tearing. The slow back-and-forth motion cuts through tissue with minimal splintering of bone. This means victims experienced clear, defined pain rather than the more chaotic sensations of rapid dismemberment. Whether this was better or worse from the victim's perspective is impossible to say. The final method we will examine was designed not to kill, but to keep alive indefinitely in conditions that made death preferable. The word comes from French, oublier, meaning to forget.
The oubliette was a dungeon designed for forgetting, a hole in the ground where prisoners were dropped and left until they died. The dimensions were precise in their cruelty, too small to lie down fully, too low to stand upright. The prisoner could only crouch or curl, unable to ever straighten their body completely. The hole was typically covered with a metal grate that let in minimal light and allowed guards to drop food and water occasionally,
if they remembered, or felt inclined, or could be bothered. Some oubliettes were completely lightless, sealed chambers where prisoners existed in absolute darkness until death. Others featured the grate, allowing prisoners to hear footsteps above them, voices of the living, reminders of the world they would never rejoin. The partial connection to life above was arguably worse than complete isolation. A political prisoner in France was discovered in an oubliette when his castle was captured by enemies in 1371.
Records indicate he had been imprisoned for 8 years. His legs no longer functioned from years of inability to straighten them. His eyes could not tolerate light. His mind had deteriorated to the point that he could not identify himself or explain why he had been imprisoned. He was released by his rescuers, but died within 6 months, his body and mind too damaged by confinement to survive freedom. The oubliette required no active torture. The imprisonment itself was the torture, continuing day after day, year after year, with no end except death. Guards did not need to do anything to their prisoners. The architecture itself inflicted suffering continuously without human intervention. Medieval castles throughout Europe contained oubliettes, some of which were only discovered during modern excavations. Archaeologists have found skeletal remains in these forgotten dungeons, prisoners who died alone in darkness and whose bodies were never retrieved.
Some oubliettes contained multiple sets of remains, suggesting new prisoners were simply dropped on top of previous occupants' bones. What psychologists note about extended isolation in confined spaces is that it causes psychological damage that can exceed even severe physical torture. The human mind requires stimulation, social contact, the ability to move through space. Deny these completely for extended periods, and the mind begins to consume itself, generating hallucinations, fragmenting identity, destroying the coherent self that makes a person a person. The oubliette was arguably the cruelest torture because it required nothing except time and darkness, resources that cost authorities nothing to provide. A prisoner in an oubliette could be forgotten, literally, their existence requiring no ongoing investment, their suffering continuing automatically until biology finally provided the release that mercy would not.
You have now learned about 20 torture methods that medieval authorities used systematically across centuries. The question that remains is why this matters beyond historical curiosity. The answer is that these techniques never entirely disappeared. They evolved, they were adapted, they continued under different names in different contexts. Water torture is used today under the name waterboarding. Sleep deprivation is documented in modern detention facilities. Stress positions that exploit the body's inability to maintain certain postures indefinitely appear in interrogation manuals that were written in this century. The isolation and sensory deprivation of oubliettes continues in solitary confinement practices that psychologists now recognize as torture. The medieval period is not safely distant history. It is the foundation on which modern systems of punishment were built.
Understanding what torturers did in the past helps us recognize when similar things are being done in the present, under different names but different justifications. The bureaucratic normalization of torture that medieval records reveal also continues. The careful documentation, the legal frameworks that permitted atrocity, the professional training of those who inflicted suffering, all of these have modern parallels. Torture becomes possible when it becomes administrative, when it is conducted according to procedures and protocols rather than recognized as the fundamental violation of human dignity it actually represents. Modern forensic archaeology continues to discover evidence of torture that was hidden or denied. Mass graves yield bones with marks that tell stories of systematic cruelty. Prison sites reveal architecture designed for suffering. Archives release documents that confirm what authorities claimed never happened. The victims of medieval torture deserve to be remembered because their suffering was real. But they also deserve to be remembered because remembering them helps us recognize when new victims are being created through similar methods. The technology changes. The fundamental dynamics of power, expressing itself through inflicted pain, remain remarkably constant. Every torture method I described tonight was considered legal by the authorities who employed it. Legal frameworks authorized the suffering. Religious institutions sanctioned it. Crowds attended public tortures as entertainment. The normalization of atrocity is perhaps the most disturbing pattern that emerges from this history, more disturbing even than the individual cruelties themselves. We like to believe that we are more civilized now, that modern societies have evolved beyond medieval brutality, but the evidence suggests otherwise. The capacity for systematized cruelty exists in every human society.
What varies is whether that capacity is constrained by laws, customs, and institutions that recognize fundamental human dignity, or unleashed by systems that prioritize authorities' power over individuals' bodies. Medieval torture victims often died knowing that their suffering was officially sanctioned, that no one would face consequences for what had been done to them, that their torment was considered righteous by the society that inflicted it. That knowledge may have been the worst torture of all. I began tonight with Giovanni Borromeo, a clerk accused of stealing 12 florins, hanging by dislocated shoulders in the darkness beneath a palace. I told you that archaeologists would find instruments and bones 500 years later that would tell his story and thousands of others.
What those archaeologists actually found, and what we have explored tonight, is evidence of industrial suffering conducted with professional precision by authorities who documented their methods carefully because they saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. They were administering justice. They were extracting truth. They were maintaining order. The fact that they did so through methods that would be recognized as monstrous by any standard of basic human decency did not trouble them, because the standards themselves did not exist in ways that constrained power. The 20 methods we examined tonight represent only a fraction of what medieval torturers developed. Hundreds of techniques existed, some so specialized they were used only in specific regions for specific crimes. The human creativity applied to causing suffering was essentially limitless, constrained only by anatomy's parameters and the need to keep victims alive long enough for torture to serve its purposes.
The victims were often innocent. The confessions torture produced were often false. The information extracted was often worthless. Medieval authorities knew this. They documented it. They wrote legal treatises about the unreliability of tortured confessions. And they continued torturing anyway, because torture served purposes beyond information extraction. Torture demonstrated power. It created fear. It warned populations about the consequences of challenging authority. It satisfied desires for vengeance and spectacle. It provided legal cover for disposing of inconvenient people. The official purposes of truth, extraction, and justice were always partial at best, pretexts for exercises of power that had darker motivations. Remember Giovanni Borromeo. Remember Isabella de Cordoba, broken by sleeplessness until she confessed to imaginary crimes. Remember Margaret of Lyon, destroyed from within by the pear.
Remember Peter Stump, broken on the wheel for crimes he almost certainly did not commit. Remember Agnes Bernauer, mutilated for marrying above her station. Remember Gheorghe Doza, flayed alive while his followers were forced to eat his flesh. Remember them because they were real people who experienced real suffering. Remember them, because their torturers kept records that allow us to know their names and their fates. Remember them, because remembering is the only justice available to those who died in circumstances where justice was never possible. And remember that the systems that tortured them, the laws and customs and institutions that made their suffering not just possible but routine, those systems were created by humans and can be created again by humans wherever power is allowed to operate without accountability. The medieval period ended. The capacity for medieval cruelty did not.